Hopefully we'll get it straightened out. All right, well, this morning we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're picking up in verse 25 in a moment. We've been going through the New Testament verse by verse, and we've made our way into 1 Corinthians, which we're going verse by verse through it as well. And we did something that, is not always the best thing in that we ended a couple of weeks ago right in the middle of a context that the Apostle Paul was in, where he's dealing with marriage with the church in Corinth. And it's a very long chapter, so we didn't have time really to go through the whole chapter. So we'll kind of recap a little bit of what was said a couple of weeks ago, hopefully without giving the whole sermon again. But basically in chapter 7, of course, it comes out of the context of the latter part of chapter 6. And in that section, the Apostle Paul was dealing with a statement that was being said either by the church at Corinth, maybe a summation of things that they assumed about what Paul was teaching, but they were saying, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. So it's believed that perhaps that first statement, all things are lawful for me, are qualified by Paul by saying not all things are profitable. So that becomes one bookend, but then when you go down to chapter 7 and verse 23, he makes the same statement again. He says all things, are lawful, but not all things are profitable. So we're seeing this as kind of the two bookends of a section that the Apostle Paul is in which he's helping the church at Corinth navigate things that maybe in some cases are lawful and are okay, but at the same time need to be brought in into a larger framework, context in which they can try to draw out what is most profitable, what is expedient, what is good in that particular case for that particular individual. And so, of course, marriage fits kind of right in the middle of all this, whereas marriage, of course, is something that's very lawful. It's one of the first things God instituted on the first day, on the sixth day of creation, when he created man and woman. Marriage was one of the first things that came out of that. And so it's definitely lawful, and it's even, given to us by God. But the Apostle Paul is kind of qualifying that and saying, okay, marriage is good, but there's also some things you got to consider as well. And this was all started and prompted by yet a statement that is believed to have been made by the church at Corinth, but again, could have been Paul. But it says in verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. All right, so said this several times before. The difficulty of 1 Corinthians is a lot of it's like listening to a conversation that's going on. Someone's on the phone, and you only hear what one person is saying. So you got to kind of surmise what the other person is saying based on what you hear that person saying. And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. That's the difficulty of 1 Corinthians sometimes, because we know that the church at Corinth had written to him, but we don't have those letters. We don't know specifically what they were asking, which statements are coming from Paul, and in these verses, which are coming from the church. But someone was saying it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So this could have been believers at Corinth who was fighting against what we saw in the latter part of chapter 6, where, harlotry was just rampant in Corinth. They worshiped the god Aphrodite, and basically harlotry was socially acceptable, and you could basically connect to a harlot at the drop of a hat. And it might have been that some of the believers at Corinth were saying, well, to fight against that, it's good for a man not to touch a woman at all, and not to get involved sexually with anyone. Or this could be the Apostle Paul saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman, because later on in the chapter he's going to say, yeah, in this particular situation, it is better for you not to marry, given the current distress, given what's going on currently in world events. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But either way, you can trace those lines and find context for that, for both of those views throughout the chapter. But he goes on to say, no, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of sexual immoralities, it is good for a man to have a wife. He says, I wish that everyone was as I am, verse 7. Everyone has his own gift from God, one in this way and one in another. He says in verse 9, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So maybe ideally, it might be good not to touch a woman given the current distress. It's good not to get married so you're going to have wholehearted devotion to the Lord. But if you have these passions, if you can't control yourself, go ahead and get married. And then he goes on to talk about, staying in the current condition that you're in. If you're married, don't try to get unmarried. Even though he's kind of nudging them in the direction of staying single just because of what was going on at that particular case or that particular point in time. He's saying, well, that doesn't mean that if you are married, get a divorce and leave your wife. Stay with your wife. And if you're not married, don't be overly concerned about getting married. Be content with where you're at, your status in life. Whether you're a slave, don't get overly obsessed about becoming free. If you're free, remember all the time that you're the Lord's slave. If you're circumcised, don't try to become uncircumcised. And there was a procedure that they had for that. And if you are not circumcised, don't seek being circumcised. In other words, when you came to the Lord, you were in a particular social status, you're in a particular situation, oriented in the world in a particular way. Don't be overly obsessed about changing that. We are a part of a heavenly kingdom, something higher than this world. And to become too obsessed with where we are in this world is to get us off base, to get us away from having our minds in the right place. So he spent quite a bit of time talking about that. And that kind of lands us back where we were in verse 25. Verse 1 through 24 is more focused on the married people. Although he does mention those who are not married, like the virgins and the widows and stuff. But the main focus is on those who are married. Now he's going to shift towards those who are not married. Big decision in life. Should I get married or not? Should I, find a spouse? The Apostle Paul is going to help them navigate that as he continues on. So he says in verse 25, now concerning virgins, as those who have not been married, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. So he says, I have no command of the Lord. In other words, when it comes to marriage, whether you should marry or not marry, there's no command of the Lord. There's no black and white. This is what's right for every person in every place at all times. The Lord never said marriage is bad, you should never marry, nor did the Lord ever say you should always get married and not to get married is to sin. There is no black and white. There was sometimes the Lord said in his teachings that you might abstain from being married. He says some people have become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. But then there's other times he says that marriage is good and has commandments in connection to that. So there's no hard, fast rule that you can go by. It says this is always right and this is always wrong. So the Apostle Paul says, I'm giving you my opinion. He says, I think I'm trustworthy to do that. I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. He'll later say in verse 40, but in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. So sometimes in life, we have to have opinions. We have to have discernment. We have to use wisdom. Not everything that we come across in life, we're going to have a book, chapter, and verse that says this is exactly what you should do. We definitely have principles in scriptures that cover most of our lives, if not all of our lives, but not everything is exactly spelled out. And so the Apostle Paul would say, this is my opinion, but I'm one who is trustworthy. And he later says he has an opinion, but he has the Holy Spirit. Opinions are not bad, but be careful where those opinions come from. Be willing to listen to advice and to receive what people have to say, what they surmise and what they conclude based on certain things. Always ask yourself, is this a trustworthy person who's giving me this advice? Is this a person who has the Holy Spirit? Is this a person who has the correct worldview? Are they looking at the situation through the right lens? Apostle Paul gets check marks on both. He's like, this isn't something that Jesus commanded. This isn't something, you die on your sword on, but I think I'm a pretty reliable source for what you should do and how you should navigate this whole situation. And we need to have people in our lives who are like that. People who we know are going to
be trustworthy in giving us their advice. People we know that aren't going to sugarcoat it, that aren't going to tell us what we want to hear, or even tell us what benefits them in the situation, but will give it to us straight and help us to know what we should do. They're trustworthy in giving us advice. That's good. And then also that are coming from the Spirit of God. So the Apostle Paul is doing that very thing for the church at Corinth. In verse 26, he says, I think then that this is good, because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Again, referencing these virgins, these people who hadn't been married. He says, this is what I think. And I'm trustworthy. You can listen to what I have to say, and this is a good opinion. I think it's good because of the present distress to remain as you are. And that, I think, is the key that unlocks this whole chapter. You have to read all of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 with that understanding that there was a present distress that was taking place at Corinth, in the world around them, that is causing and prompting the Apostle Paul to give them the advice that he's given. Because we're going to get into some verses where the Apostle Paul is going to sound a lot like he thinks marriage is bad, like that's not a good option. But we have to keep in mind that there was a present distress. There were things that were going on. He doesn't go into detail what he's talking about. He could just be talking about those occasional eruptions and persecutions that would arise from the Jewish community. Nero is going to start persecuting the church about 9 years from when the Apostle Paul is writing 1 Corinthians in AD 64. That's when Rome burns, and then he starts blaming the Christians. Maybe he's talking about something that's going to be coming up in the future. Whatever it is, there was something that was going on that he says, under this present distress, it's better not to get married. And we talked about why that would be important, right? If you're being persecuted, or if you're having to pack up and leave and you're having to move around a lot, if you're married, it's a lot more difficult to do that. It'd be a lot more difficult as a married man with children and a wife. Obviously, I have a wife if I'm married, but it's a lot difficult for you to take a bullet for the Lord when you got to consider your family. You got to consider other people who you're going to be leaving behind. That makes it a lot more challenging. But if you're by yourself, you're just a single person, you can be a little bit more wholly devoted to the Lord. And he'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. He's saying, given the present distress, it might be better. You'll be happier. You'll be less conflicted inside if you can just stay single, if that's an option for you. He says in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. In other words, enter into who you are in Christ, serve the Lord, be a diligent citizen of the kingdom of God wherever you're at, whatever status you have, whether you're married or not married. Some people might be obsessed by the fact that they are married. Oh, well, also Paul says it's better to be single, and I got married, I guess I messed up. Now I'm stuck with a wife, or I'm stuck with a husband, and now I can't be wholly devoted, and I must have made a mistake in getting married. Don't seek to be released. Serve the Lord in that. Honor the Lord in that. You can honor the Lord. You can definitely honor the Lord in marriage in 1,000 different ways. Step into that. Embrace that. Move forward in that. And don't look back with regret. But if you've been released from a wife, maybe she left because she was an unbeliever, as he talked about previously in the context, and didn't want to have anything to do with you anymore, he says, don't seek a wife. Don't get overly obsessed about these things. Just serve the Lord where you're at. He says in verse 28, but if you marry, you have not sinned. All right, so getting married is not a sin. He's being very conscientious of the fact that some people might take what he's saying and just run with it. As a matter of fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, the Apostle Paul actually warned Timothy that a time would come when people would actually do that. Starting in verse 1, he says, but the Spirit explicitly says that in latter times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons by the hypocrisy of liars, who have been seared in their own conscience, who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God created to be shared in with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. The time would come when people would say, yes, it is wrong to get married. But Paul says, he's being very careful saying, that's not what I'm teaching. I'm not saying that marriage is wrong at all. I'm just giving you advice given the present distress. But he does go on to say, continuing in verse 28,
Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. Okay, so this isn't a matter of right or wrong, sin or not sin. This is a matter of what's best for you in this present situation. And I want to spare you of all the trouble that might come. And that's typically what someone's doing when they're giving you good advice, right? They're trying to spare you a lot of difficulties, especially people who have been there and done that. They look back on their lives and look, I know what's down that road. Even if it's something that's not sinful, I can give you some advice and say, I want to spare you what would be going down that road and help you navigate the other direction. And help them out in that way. And the Apostle Paul is doing that here. In verse 29, but this I say, brothers, the time has been shortened, so that from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who cry as though they did not cry, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away. This, to me, is the best set of verses that describe our relationship to the world. Like if someone comes to me and asks me, hey Joey, what does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? Like how do you do that? How can you be in the world but not be of the world? Seems like a contradictory thing. Clearly in John chapter 17, in Jesus' high priestly prayer, he said, they're in the world but not of the world, just as I am not in the world but not of the world, or just as I am not of the world. And I say, how do we navigate that? How do we know when we're too much of the world, even though we're still in the world? Well, the Apostle Paul tells us, being in the world but not of the world doesn't mean that you don't still cry, that you don't still rejoice, that you don't still buy and possess. And it doesn't mean that you don't marry and all these different things. It doesn't mean that you don't engage in the things of the world. We're in the world, we marry, we buy things, we possess things, we interact with this world around us. But the idea is that we don't become obsessed with those things. We do not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing away. In other words, we don't become obsessed about those things. I think we all know individuals who, they're married and they're obsessed with their marriage. Like they hold on to their marriage with tight fists, and that's their whole energy, their whole life, everything. They're just obsessed with being married. Or some people are just obsessed with their job. They cling to their job. They work, a whole lot of hours, not because they have to, but just because, they're just so obsessed with their job or their career, or you're obsessed about possessing things and owning things, and we just become so connected to the things of this world that it gets us off course. There ought to always be this disposition of heart where I say, these things matter, the things in the world matter, and these things are important, but they're not they're not entirely what I'm all about. There's still a separation between me and these outward circumstances. We have an inner man, an inner person within us, a spirit that God has given us that's connected to a spiritual realm, a heavenly realm that is far beyond this world. And too often we live in the outer man, in the outer person who's always influenced and moved and carried about by the things that are going on in this world. We always ought to have that inner peace within us, that spiritual connection to God that gives us at least a little bit of separation from what's going on in this world. I like to kind of think of it as a scuba diver, of all analogies, but as a scuba diver, I think that's kind of what he does, right? He's down in the ocean, and he's got on his scuba gear. He's able to be in the ocean, but he's not of the ocean, right? He knows all the while he's not a fish, and he knows eventually he's got to go get oxygen. He knows that he is not of the ocean, even though he's in the ocean. He might interact with the things in the ocean, but he's not a fish. He's not a shark. He's not any of those things. He's a human being. And we too, we're in this world, but we are spiritually reborn into the heavenly kingdom. We've been born of the Spirit. We're citizens of heaven. We are connected branches to the vine, and we are not of this world. And we always have to keep that in mind. Doesn't mean the world can't influence. We still cry, we still rejoice, we still buy, we still marry, we still do these things, but recognizing the fact that we are not truly of this world. Because this world is passing away. Isn't that better? Be a lot better. I know if I was a scuba diver and I was in a aquarium and I knew the water was running out and that eventually there would be no more water in the aquarium, I'd be very thankful that I'm a human. When all the water is gone, I'm still alive. I can take off that mask and I can breathe the air. And that's how it's going to be in this world. This world is going to pass away. The water is going to run out. But those who are born by the Holy Spirit, when it all runs out, we have heavenly air to breathe. We're going to keep on going, and we're going to be living forever. So everything will pass away, but we'll still be alive and living before God. We always have to keep that in the forefront of our minds. Otherwise, we're going to think it's all about this world. Always focused on what's going on around me. Oh, that fish looked at me wrong. I don't like the way the tides of the waters are running right now. It's okay. It's okay. You're not of the water. You are a human being. You will live past these things. All those things will be gone. The things that concern you now are going to pass away. I remember my dad saying one time in a sermon, the things that you're worried about today, I guarantee you in a year, you're not going to remember that they happened. Most things. Like the things that we get so in angst about, a year from now, July, was it 25th or whatever, 2027, we're going to be like, what was I even thinking about back then? All these things are just passing. They're like water running under the bridge. Paul would say, let's not get too worked up about it. Let's not get too obsessed where we are in this world, how this world is engaging with us. The form of this world is passing away. In 1 John chapter 2, the Apostle John says the same thing. Starting in verse 15. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, and also its lust. But the one who does the will of God abides forever. You're going to keep on going. Long past this world, once it's gone, you're going to keep on going. You're going to still be alive. You're going to abide forever because you are endued with this eternal life that God has imparted to you through Jesus Christ. He says in verse 32, now we're going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But I want you to be free from concern. All right? Don't get too worked up whether you're married or not, but I do want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And his interests have been divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Now, this is kind of like the book of Proverbs, where he's given general principles, right? You can always think of the exception and things like that, but it's given us general truths. And the same is true with what Paul's doing here. Definitely we can think of exceptions. There's single people who are single just because they want to amass more stuff for themselves. They don't want to share with a family, or they want to be able to do their own thing. They want the freedom. Obviously, there's single people who aren't concerned about the things of the Lord. And there's married people who are very devoted to the Lord. The husband and wife are a spiritual team brought together to do the Lord's work, and they work together to do that, and that's the way that it can work out in that way. So there's exceptions to this, but the Apostle Paul is saying the general way things run oftentimes is the single person is free to adapt or free to go out and do and move about without having to be concerned about a wife or children or things like that. The Apostle Paul is a perfect example. He was not married. The Apostle Paul, before he went on a missionary trip, didn't have to sit down with his wife and say, okay, honey, this is what the Lord's calling me to do. I'm going to be away from the family for a few months. I might even die. He didn't have to do that. He just, when the Spirit led him, he just took off and went. A single person is able to do that. And a married person is oftentimes concerned about their spouse. They always have to keep them in mind. And that's generally a good thing. You want to be concerned about your spouse and their well-being. But at the same time, now there's a conflict that can sometimes take place between what your spouse wants and what the Lord wants. And that can sometimes cause an issue. And so the Apostle Paul's saying, if you don't get married, you don't have to worry about all that. You're free to do whatever, and you can go out and do the Lord's work, and you won't have your interests divided like that. So he says, verse 35, now this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote propriety and undistracted devotion to the Lord. And this is where we make a very, very important point. As we look over the chapter, and we go back to the beginning of the chapter, a statement that that Paul made here in the chapter, he said this. In verses 8 and 9, he says, "But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them that they remain even as I am," that is, single. "But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Better to marry than to burn with passion. Now think about what we just read later on in the chapter where he said, you need to not be married to have wholehearted devotion to the Lord. I think what we have here is a hierarchy of things. At the beginning, the Apostle Paul would tell you and tell us, get married even though you're not going to be as devoted to the Lord. You're going to have this conflict and this distraction to keep you from sinning. The very first thing we should ever consider when we're dealing with things that maybe aren't sinful in and of themselves is, will this thing lead me into sin? Or will this thing lead me out of sin? Above even what will lead me to be more devoted to the Lord in service to the Lord. You say, well, how can that be the case? Well, let's just stick with the marriage analogy, right? Person may stay single to be more devoted to the Lord, be more free to do whatever he calls them to do, and they may work hard. They may have, the minute they're off from work, they may be out doing work for the Lord, teaching people, helping the homeless, doing all these different things, but they lack self-control sexually, and they fall into sin repeatedly. Maybe with the Corinthian believers, with the harlots that were all the way around. We talked about how back then you could just slip into a room, sleep with a harlot, and then just go out and walk like it never happened. Like, it was very prevalent. You have the single person who's, yes, more wholly devoted to the Lord, but committing these sins over and over again. That sin that's in that person's life could destroy all the work they're doing. It might be that they work very hard for the Lord, but because of their sin and their lack of self-control, everything else gets consumed by that sin, and it's as though they didn't do any work at all. First, get in a position where you're limiting your sin's influence in your life, and then worry about what will cause you to be more devoted to the Lord. That's the more important thing. I think a good example is social media. And here I am doing a video on social media, but it's not social media is wrong in and of itself. I don't think social media is inherently wrong. But how often do people allow social media to create sins in their life, thinking that, well, every once in a while I get that inspirational meme or whatever that helps me spiritually, or every once in a while that video comes up that benefits me spiritually, even though all the while I'm scrolling, I'm tempted to covet what other people have. I become discontent with my life. I start becoming depressed because I see everyone else's life painted in pretty colors. Maybe lust. And all the while, we think, well, it's okay because I get an inspirational meme every once in a while. I don't care how much social media is helping you spiritually. If it's leading you into sin, we need to cut it out. Cut it out. Take what's her name? Elsa, and just let it go. And take her advice. Let it go. It's not worth it. There's plenty of other ways to be benefited spiritually without dragging along something that's causing you to sin. Now, some people can engage in social media and be fine. I'm not talking to them. You might be able to get on there and I don't care what that person, you might care what they're doing, but it doesn't really influence your life, and you realize that disconnect. But some people can. Just something to keep in mind. And that's just one example, perhaps of many that we can make in connection to this. But really, abstaining from sin is your number one concern. Once you got that taken care of, then worry about being devoted to the Lord. Also, Paul would say it's better if you have self-control and that you don't have a problem with sexual sin, that you can remain single, then you got the full package. Then you can go out and just do, the work of the Lord. But that's not always the case for everybody. So, continuing on in verse 36, he says, but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, that's the Legacy Standard Bible. We'll talk about that more in a moment. If she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no compulsion, but has authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. All right, some translation things here. The Legacy Standard Bible goes with the traditional view, which I always kind of lean towards the traditional view. I think it's a tradition for a reason. For thousands of years, people have interpreted this as a virgin daughter. And I think that's why the Legacy Standard Bible inserts daughter. That's not in the original. But there are other interpretations and ways of translating which you could say is virgin fiance. So it's like I'm engaged, I have a fiance. Obviously, she's a virgin. She hasn't been married yet. He could say, if you think you're acting unbecoming towards her, if you're lacking self-control in connection to your fiance, go ahead and get married. You're not sinning. But if you choose not to marry her, you're not sinning either. But you just have to navigate that. The more traditional view is that a man has a virgin daughter. Remember, back then, they had arranged marriages. The dad would choose his daughter married. I kind of like that. It's kind of, but I say no. But no, back then, if you were the dad, you chose who your daughters would marry. Remember with Jacob, Leah and Rachel, that went back to Laban. He had control over who married who. But anyways, so the traditional view of this is that a man has a daughter, but there's all these social pressures to have her married off. There could be political reasons you might want her to get married. There might just be the fact that that's just what's socially acceptable. I'm going to give my daughter to marriage. If you can control all that, navigate all that, and still remain firm in your conviction that I know that my daughter will be more devoted to the Lord if she's not married, he says, do that. But then again, he says, but you're not sinning if you do give her to marriage. That's also an option for you as well. And so that's kind of the main two interpretations of this section. But either interpretation brings us back to the same thing. To marry is not a sin. Not to marry is not a sin. Each person must consider their own circumstances, their own situation, their own arrangement in the world, and everything in their particular context. So, again, this isn't a sin thing. This isn't a commandment. This is Paul giving good advice. Then in verse 39, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband has fallen asleep, she is free to be married. I was reading this to the family yesterday, and my wife was like, yes, when you fall asleep, I'm free. This is, he's not saying literally if he falls asleep. Of course, it's a euphemism, or that's just a way of saying if he dies, okay? I'm not saying if your husband falls asleep, all right, I'm going to go marry somebody else. No, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband has fallen asleep, so there's the contrast. If he lives, contrasted with falling asleep, which implies death. Legacy Standard is very literal. I think some translations would actually say if he dies, just to help the reader out. But he says, you are bound as long as you live. In other words, whatever decision you make, stick with it. It's not a matter of sin as long as you're trying to decide on this side whether I should marry or whether I should not marry. But the Apostle Paul would say, but you know what? If you do decide to get married, and that's a decision you made, stay with it. Stick with it. Even if later on you think, well, I don't know if that's a good decision, maybe I could be more devoted to the Lord. Stick with it. You're married. You're bound to your wife. You're bound to your husband. Live in that. Embrace it. Honor God in that. Glorify God in that. And move forward. Now, if your spouse dies, then you're free to marry. Romans chapter 7 talks about that, but there he's talking about more with a spiritual application, but kind of the same idea. And in verse 40 he says, but in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. In other words, she's a wife, her husband dies in, he may be using the wife because the husband typically dies before the wife, whether because he's a soldier or because of the wear and tear of working and laboring, or just the fact that men die before women, generally speaking. But anyways, he says, if she has a wife, or if she is a wife and she becomes a widow because her husband died, in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. And he says, I think that I also have the Spirit of God. You'll be happier if you just stay like you are. And so he's given his opinion. So as we look at this whole chapter, we're getting a lot of principle about a lot of different things. It's about marriage and it's about whether I should marry or not marry, which is a very important decision, a life decision, but a lot of principles too. What do I do with anything in my life that I'm considering that isn't that's moral or amoral? It's not wrong. I mean, it's amoral. It's not right or wrong. It just is. How do I do that? First, is this going to lead me into sin? Or will it help me escape sin? And then two, will this help me in my devotion to the Lord? And will this help me further progress in my spiritual life? Pretty simple, two simple rules to kind of look at things through and things to consider. Well, if you're here this morning, by way of invitation, I would kind of tell you the same thing. Coming to the Lord is the right decision. If you're trying to consider whether to connect yourself to Christ and to now give your life over to Christ, guess what? He's going to lead you out of sin. He's going to give you forgiveness of your sins, one, and you'll stand justified before God. In other words, you'll receive a not guilty verdict before the judge of all the world, which is pretty good. But then also he's going to lead you out of a life of sin to help you live a more pure life, a righteous life, where sin won't be always nagging at you and pulling you down, but you'll be able to more and more be released from its power and its influence in your life. But also, he'll lead you into a life of devotion. Obviously, you'll be more devoted to the Lord if you're connected to him in that way, and you'll be able to live a life with a higher purpose, a greater purpose, to realize the aquarium is leaking water. One day, all the water is going to be gone. Where am I going to be at when that happens? I want to go ahead and start living for that situation. Be prepared today and be devoted to God, and know that the work that I do is not in vain, because life goes on beyond this life. So if you'd like to share in that this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that Dylan has prepared.